Welcome back to the Clear Admit MBA Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Graham Richmond, and today we are going to tackle the GRE versus the GMAT exams, and I am so thrilled to have two very special guests from Veritas Prep, a leading test preparation and MBA admissions consulting firm. So I've got Brian Galvin with me today, who's the Chief Academic Officer for Veritas Prep. Brian owns a 99th percentile on the GMAT exam. And he does stand-up comedy, also is the owner of an NBA championship ring. So lots of interesting things in Brian's background. Brian, thanks so much for making time and joining us today. And you're going to kind of represent the GMAT in today's discussion.
Exactly. It's weird to say, but I actually love the GMAT, so I'm proud to be here in its defense.
So, and in the other corner today, I'm joined by David Newland, who is a veteran GRE and GMAT instructor. David happens to own a perfect score on the GRE and is one of the most experienced test prep experts in the world. And David, you've got several degrees. I think that actually both you and Brian are Michigan grads. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And just like Tom Brady, I don't like to lose.
So David, thanks for making time. And again, both of you do terrific work over at Veritas Prep. So, obviously we always encourage our listeners to check out what Veritas has on offer in the test prep domain and admissions consulting and all that good stuff. But today we're going to have this kind of rematch, GMAT versus GRE. We know that a lot of our listeners often pose this very question and, are trying to decide like which test is the right one to take. And I just want to kind of a spoiler alert here. I don't think we're going to really crown a victor today. Like that's not the point of this episode. It's really what we're going to try to do is give our listeners all the tools they need to make the decision about which test is right for them. And so we're actually, if you have pencils or pens, get them out because we have a checklist that we're going to give you. And just like, the Supreme Court has 9 justices, we're going to have 9 categories that you're going to put a check mark in for one test or the other. And so there will be no ties, so as you listen along here, keep track, and you should know by the end of this episode which test is for you. Before we dive in and have you guys start arguing and making your case, I wanted to just put out a couple of myths that people think of when they think of these two exams. And, one of the first ones is that the GMAT is the better test for business schools because, business schools prefer it. They've been taking it forever and they kind of tolerate the GRE, but they prefer the GMAT. So that's one myth that's out there. Another is that like if you're a banker or anyone in a typical MBA feeder role, and you're not applying to other kind of non-business masters, then you would be foolish to take the GRE. So that's another myth that's out there. And a third one I wanted to just put out there as we get into this discussion is that business schools are kind of silly to take so many tests. It sort of dilutes the seriousness of their degree. And so, that's just a kind of more general thought. But these are all things that are out there that people hear. And so I want to have that in the background as we dive into our checklist. So, David, I want to start with you. And our first category is going to be ease or kind of difficulty level with these two exams. And so, which test is easier or is one easier than the other? So David, representing GRE, what do you kind of think about that part of this?
Hey, thanks, Graham. So let me just say that I think that the GRE is probably an easier test overall. Now, as you're going to find, as you said already with a spoiler alert, we're not trying to tell you that one is the winner, one is, knocked out. But what I want to tell you is that those folks that are considering thinking about taking the GRE, it is considered to be an easier test overall in terms of the amount that you have to study for, the amount of time it takes to study. You do get a calculator on the screen. And I know that when I retook the SAT many years after, I had taken it the first time, I was shocked to find that all the math on there was calculator based. So people might be a little bit more familiar with having a calculator in hand. You can also flag questions and come back to them, which takes that test anxiety pressure that the GMAT puts on you and kind of brings that down a little bit. You have an actual pencil and paper for notes instead of this, this wet erase marker and these laminated sheets, which is particularly interesting for people who are left-handed, who just tend to smudge the wet erase right down the page. So our left-handed folks might like that pencil and paper a little bit, and there's no integrated reasoning section to study for. So that takes a whole segment out that the GMAT has. So I've definitely had, and here's my crowning argument. And Brian, let's see if you can deal with this. I've had quite a few people who've studied the GMAT, moved to the GRE. I think I've had close to zero people move from the GRE to the GMAT.
Okay. So Brian, what say you? I mean, is the GRE the easier test?
We teach statistics and critical thinking for a living, David. Just the fact that a handful of people that have moved from one test to the other, that's not enough of a sample size, man. I don't know if you can be making that claim. I'll say the GRE is an easier test, and it's easier, particularly on the quantitative section. It doesn't require as deep of critical thinking. The quantitative comparison question type isn't nearly as just involved and kind of gnarly and punishing as data sufficiency can be. So particularly on the math, so I'll concede that point. But I also think it's important to recognize that it's easier for everyone. And so it's not as forgiving. The GMAT is built on the assumption with its question by question adaptivity that everybody's going to make a few mistakes. And so you don't have to get them all right. You're able to miss several questions and still get a really high score. On the GRE quantitative section, you miss a question or two and all of a sudden your percentile starts plummeting. And so I think the fact that it's easier for everyone, you think if you're really good, right? You think you're a great baseball team, you'd rather play a best of 25 series than a one game winner take all. Like a fluke can happen once, but if you're really good, you want to prove that out over time. So I think for people who feel comfortable with math, you probably want, I look at myself and I'm good for a silly mistake here or there, but I can get pretty much any question right. And so I would much rather take the GMAT where if I make one or two mistakes, I still have a chance to make it up versus the GRE, which is going to be I think it's a more punishing algorithm because it's just not as forgiving. So that's where I'd say if you feel comfortable enough with the math, the GMAT gives you a chance to show your ability and gives you a little bit of flexibility. And then there's some other just sort of nuances to it. You get more breaks on the GMAT and fewer time in between. So once you've taken the math or verbal section, you get a break to refresh your mind before the other. You don't get an entire experimental section like you do on the GRE. There's just a handful of experimental questions. So you're not there taking an entire section, wasting mental energy on a section that doesn't matter because they're just using it for research purposes. And you can pick the order in which you take it. So if, on the GRE, you have to do the two essays first. On the GMAT, you can put your strong suit up front, leave the essays, which, the essay and IR, which don't matter as much for last. And so you get a little bit of preference there. So kind of my summary, if you're comfortable enough with the math in particular, the GMAT gives you a chance to get away with a couple of silly mistakes under pressure and still recover in a way the GRE doesn't.
Okay, great. So arguments on both sides there. Let's move to the second category, which is the calculator. And I know that sounds silly to have a whole category around the calculator, but it's kind of a big deal, right? So David, do you want to speak to that since the GRE has a calculator for people to use on screen and the GMAT does not? So what do you think about that, David?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Thanks, Graham. So just, kind of winding up that last one. So Brian and I definitely agree to disagree. It's like a little bit of the beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? So put that first check mark in either column. If you prefer some of the things that I talked about, like the calculator and being able to go back and forth and, pencils for left-handers and things like that. And if you prefer the chance to maybe miss a few questions, put the check mark in the GMAT if you like Brian's argument. And we'll keep doing that right on down. The calculator is one of the things that I mentioned for the ease of the use. And I'm just going to have a very simple question, and I'd like for Brian to be able to answer this one. Why wouldn't you want to have a calculator?
I could speak to that. I would say because everybody gets a calculator, right? So the story behind, so on the GMAT, you actually do get to use a calculator once on the integrated reasoning section. And I remember asking the people at GMAT in one of the meetings we had, sort of, hey, why did you allow a calculator there? Like, sort of your whole game is, that it's more of a critical thinking test and not as much of a number crunching test. And their answer was, believe it or not, we just didn't want people to complain about not having it. We don't think you need it, but, we just didn't want people to complain. We're adding a new section, and we figured we'd give customer service a break from calls from angry students. So, if the questions are designed where you don't need a calculator, again, I think it's all about competitive advantage. I think anybody taking the time to listen to this podcast who's putting real time and thought and energy into, determining, what the best course of action is, which test should they take, how to best prepare, all those kind of things. If you're somebody who's willing to work a little bit harder and kind of figure out how to be efficient without a calculator, you have a competitive advantage over the people who kind of, would use it as a crutch. So, I think in a lot of cases, David, we've both taken, both tests and done a lot of work on them. Sometimes if you know what you're doing, the calculator takes more time than being able to, some of the things, the GMAT will have you do of like, look at the units digit. You don't need to do that long calculator. Only one answer choice could possibly end in a 6 or something like that. And so, the GMAT's designed where you don't need it. And so, in that case, I would say, no, I don't really want what I don't need. I want to try to, I want that competitive advantage.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you guys right, I mean, on the one hand, the GRE has a calculator, which, can make for ease of computations and things. But on the other hand, what you're saying, Brian, is that, well, everyone's got the calculator, so it's kind of a leveling thing. And on the GMAT, there isn't one, and you don't get sort of bogged down in having to use one. And so I hear what you're both saying. I mean, I think, again, this comes down to user preference. Some people who are kind of using calculators all the time in their daily life, at work, whatever, maybe they like that, and it's sort of like they don't have an issue using it. Other people, maybe they don't, and it would kind of slow them down or something to have to go in and start doing calculations on a calculator rather than finding those kind of shortcuts in their head and doing it. So again, could go either way, but I think it is an interesting point. I mean, it's a real distinctive difference between the two exams. So excellent points there. The third point that we're going to get into for people's checklists here is applicability, like which test is really, meant for which type of a degree. So Brian, I want to turn to you because the GMAT, on some levels, I mean, it's a test that was designed by business schools for the admissions process. So what do you have to say about the applicability of these tests?
Yeah, great question. And I think this is one of the myths you brought up sort of at the beginning. I think traditionally, and we're on 6 or 7 years of, premium schools accepting the GRE. And so the longer this podcast goes, the longer the tail on people listening to this in, 2021, 2025, whatever, I think this argument will lose even more of its heft, I guess. The GRE has kind of been seen traditionally as a side door for non-traditional candidates. Somebody who, the two main arguments for business schools taking the GRE was one, hey, if somebody's thinking about public policy, public health, other kinds of careers, and maybe also thinking about an MBA, we don't want to lose out on them because, they ran out of time to take an additional test, or they didn't want to spend $250 to take an additional test or something like that. Hey, let's broaden our ability to attract candidates, and particularly as we're at peak employment and fewer people are applying, it's kind of hey, let's broaden our scope. The other one was, for the longest time, and it's still true in many of the rankings, you don't have to report your average GRE score, but you do have to report your average GMAT score. And so it's a way to accept someone who you really like, but whose score would be a liability. Somebody who may have a low 600s, high 500 score. You love them, but man, they're going to ding your average a little, especially if you get a handful more of those candidates. So it's traditionally been seen as a side door, and so kind of traditional business school candidates, bankers, consultants, have been kind of instructed, take the GMAT because that's what they're accepting. Now, like I said, if it's been a long time that they're taking the GRE, I think the longer this goes on, the less they're able to say, well, publicly we say you could take either one, but privately we'll never tell you this. We're going to look down on you for the GRE. So I think that I'm doing some of David's advocacy for him. I think that argument is lessening, but that's sort of been the mindset of a lot of people, but it's kind of been a side door.
So, David, what do you think about this? I mean, is the GMAT the test that business schools still prefer kind of secretly, even though they tolerate the GRE, or do you think that's really opening up?
Thanks. So we actually have two kind of different issues here, and it's really funny. Brian was kind of advocating for the GRE for a second there, and I'm going to just advocate for the GMAT just for a minute. I've often said that I think that when you go to business school, you should enter with 6 credit hours, because I think that studying for the GMAT actually is doing part of the work that the business school might do for them. When you come in there and you've studied grammar, when you come in there and you've studied critical reasoning as a full third of the verbal section and reading comprehension and all of that math, I mean, you're actually preparing for business school. And so the GMAT does that more than the GRE. So if what you're really interested in is like a business school prep class, so that when you get into business school, you're ready to rock it from day one, I mean, I think you can't really do better than the GMAT. But if we're talking about getting into business school, and I think a lot of people, that's what they're looking for, I kind of have a little bit of a test that I ask people. If you could score really well on either test, like Brian Galvin, for example, could do. If you could score really well on either test, then you would go for the GMAT, because those are still the scores that are, most reported. And so if you have a little bit, you don't have a lot of work background, your GPA isn't as high as it could have been, you're looking for this test to really pull you up, that's the GMAT. The GRE is more the test. Brian was mentioning that candidate who has, won the Nobel Peace Prize or something, and the school really wants to admit them, and they just need some kind of a score. So if you have a really great background and you're maybe not going to score as high, then the GRE is the clear choice for you. So, if you're going to go really well, GMAT. If you're probably not going to go really well, GRE. If you're somewhere in between, that's what this checklist is for. Which test are you going to perform better on? Because as Brian said, as time goes on, the GRE, the GMAT, really going to be accepted just about the same.
Yeah, fair enough. That's really, really excellent insight. I mean, I want to stick with you, David, as we move into the next category, which is math. And there's a lot of discussion. I mean, we hear over and over again on the Clear Admit, forums like the Livewire, all these people kind of chat about this stuff, and they often say, oh, the math is easier on the GRE. So I want to start with you. Let's talk math. What do you think about the math sections on these tests? What makes the GRE the right choice for folks?
Those folks on your Clear Admit website are absolutely correct. The math on the GRE is easier. I've gotten several perfect verbal GMAT scores. In fact, a 51 out of 51, which is 7 points above the 99th percentile. So I don't know if that's like the 106th percentile or the 99.9 or something like that. But I typically don't miss a single question on the GMAT verbal reasoning section. But I've never gotten a perfect GMAT score because they've got this other section, and it's called the math. Whereas on the GRE, the first time I went in there, I was able to get a perfect math score on the GRE. So that should tell you, where my thought is. The GRE, the math is straightforward. If you know the rules and you can check your work, it is easier, and the GMAT is a little bit more abstract, especially something called data sufficiency, which if somebody is coming from a math background, that data sufficiency can really still give them problems.
Yeah. Okay. So, Brian, what do you have to say about this?
Yeah, David makes some pretty compelling points there, and definitely kind of puffs up his expertise there by listing his scores. I like that. The GRE math is just clearly easier. It's just more straightforward. If you're someone who wants to memorize the flashcards and know the steps and just kind of really clear cut, this is how you solve this kind of problem. Whereas the GMAT requires a little more creative, critical thinking, I think for most of us. And so, it comes down to what's your competitive advantage. I'm someone who, like I said, can get most problems right, in a reasonable amount of time. But man, I make some dumb mistakes. I write if I'm writing fast, my fours look like sevens, or I'll transpose digits, and I'm good for a couple of silly mistakes. I like the GMAT because it gives me the opportunity to recover from mistakes. I don't need to be as perfect because it's not an easy test. Whereas the GRE, I think a handful of silly mistakes all of a sudden takes me from a really high score where I want to be, kind of close to a perfect score, down quite a few percentile points. So it comes down to competitive advantage. It's easier on the GRE, but it's easier for everybody. And so if you're great at straightforward steps and really good at double checking and not making mistakes, take the GRE. If you know you're kind of a nutty professor type a little bit, you can really punch with the best of them on your best day, but every once in a while you succumb to easy mistakes. The GMAT I think is a good choice for you because kind of rewards your style of thinking.
Okay, well said. I think, so when it comes to the math, if you're putting a check mark at home here, it sounds like the GRE math section is a bit easier, but again, perhaps less forgiving. And so if you're someone who's prone to some absent-minded mistakes or things like that, the GMAT may make more sense. Let's, while we're talking about sections of these tests, let's talk a little bit about verbal and in particular the kind of reading comp type sections that these tests have. Brian, I want to start with you. Tell me a little bit about the kind of reading comp section on the GMAT and why you think it's kind of what's the case that you can make for this over the GRE?
It's a good question. I think this is where having people that know these tests inside and out is pretty helpful. And I think David and I would agree on this. So they both have reading comprehension. The passages are fairly similar. The question types are fairly similar. The GRE will go deep into the weeds. GRE is a little bit more inference heavy. So those questions that, the answers must be true, and they've got a couple different kind of formats there, but for the most part, they're pretty similar in terms of content of the passages and, types of questions and all that. What we've found is GMAT reading comprehension is tight. And what I mean by that is if you go back and read their explanation or, talk to somebody who's kind of an expert in it, the 4 wrong answers are fatally flawed. And the 1 remaining answer is definitely right every time. You just can't poke holes in GMAT reading comprehension questions. GRE, I think you get a handful of experts, people who are really good at both tests together. And, it's not a huge percentage, but maybe 1 out of every 15 or 20 questions, there's some subjectivity in there. So as I've taught both tests, I prefer teaching the GMAT because if it's right, it's right, and if it's wrong, it's wrong. The GRE, there's a lot of times that feeling of, it's kind of subjective. It's, GMAT, there's no such thing as a good answer and a better answer. There's 1 right, 4 wrong. The GRE gets a little bit looser there, and so maybe as kind of a purist, but also somebody who wants to always feel confident and know that, when I answer, like, if I find the flaws, they're wrong, and if, whichever one is left is remaining. I like that kind of certainty on GMAT reading comprehension, which seems a little bit less so on the GRE. But David may have more to say on that as the GRE perfect scorer. He's figured it out.
All right, so before we go, and David, I want to hear from you about kind of GRE and is it true that things are a little looser with reading comp? I did want to just confirm with both of you that, whatever the case, these reading passages on the tests are truly fascinating and incredibly engaging for those taking the test, right?
Always. If you finish the test and you don't go home and tell, everybody about what you just learned about, like life cycles of earthworms, you're wasting some of your test money.
I think both of these companies, ETS and, Pearson making these tests, they could actually have a side business and just kind of compiling reading comp for kind of folks with insomnia, just good bedside reading as you're trying to, to fall asleep. But in all seriousness, David, so tell us a little bit more about reading comp on the GRE. Is Brian making a fair point, or do you disagree?
I think you guys are actually making fun of me. I just taught the reading comprehension for my GMAT class the other day, and I was just telling the students that I finally figured out why I never miss questions on any reading comp, LSAT, GMAT, GRE. It's because I literally am fascinated and thinking about who I'm going to tell, which victim am I going to explain this entire reading comp passage to. So you've actually hit on my strategy for success, which is to love every reading comp passage, whether I do or not. So I totally agree. The GMAT, and if we don't have enough tests in here, let me just throw the LSAT, the law school test, in there, because the GRE is now competing with the LSAT, right? The GRE is now accepted by law schools. The GMAT and the LSAT have perfect reading comp, and the GRE, it is a little bit looser. I will agree to that, especially because it doesn't have just choose one. It has choose all that apply. And so you can't do a straight process of elimination on these reading comp choose all that apply. So you might have one that's clearly an inference, and then the other 2 could be. And sometimes it is almost arguable. I would say that there is still a right answer, but you can actually learn how to deal with that GRE. I can definitely, help you figure out what they're going to consider to be must be true and what's not. So you can learn the GRE, even if it's not perfect, right? But what you do get with the GRE is the ability to flag a question and come back at the end, the ability to flip through the questions, the ability to save the reading comprehension sections for last, and do the two vocab sections first, and so you know how much time you have total. So the GRE gives you more flexibility, move back and forth, save it for last, flag it, and the only price you have to pay is, every once in a while one of the answers is going to be a little bit looser, and you might be a little bit ready to argue with it. So that's where your check marks goes. You want a little bit better reading comp, or do you want a little bit more flexibility?
Okay, so I think for folks trying to make a check in one test or the other when it comes to the reading comp, it sounds like, how important is it to be able to go back and forth and kind of review answers or flag things, as you say. If that's really important, then they might want to put a check mark for GRE. With that said, how important is it that, the reading comp be incredibly straightforward in terms of, their very clear right and wrong answers? Then maybe the GMAT kind of gets some points in favor there. While we're on verbal, I want to move to the other piece of the verbal on these exams, which in this case is like pretty radically different, right? So GMAT has sentence corrections, which is kind of grammar, whereas the GRE has a kind of vocab section. And so I want to talk about that because those are, they're really different. And so, David, why don't you start this one? What do you think about the GRE and their kind of use of vocab versus, the GMAT, which has this kind of grammar sentence correction thing going on?
Great. So people always, and you said in your forum, clear admit that people talk about the math section. But when somebody says to me, David, should I switch over, or which one should I start with? This is always my first question. Grammar or vocabulary? Always my first question, because I think this is the biggest difference. I had a student who is just graduating from MIT, who came originally from Venezuela through Chile, and he spent 3 years on sentence correction to be able to get himself to MIT. I think that vocabulary would not have taken him 3 years. He had a great vocabulary. So it really depends on the student. I mean, do you have 3 years to spend? Now, other people might have the grammar down and not the vocabulary. It actually turns out that native English speakers often have a lot more vocabulary than they think, and non-native English speakers often have a lot more grammar because of the way that they're taught to get ready for the TOEFL and things like that. So it just really depends. The GRE vocab isn't like it used to be. It's not a bunch of words that you've never heard of. It's a lot more of what I call GRE critical reasoning. And if you know 2/3 of the words, by using process of elimination and critical reasoning techniques, I can get you to almost 100% right on that. For knowing 66% of the words, we can get just about 100% accuracy. So the vocab isn't quite what you're thinking. It's more of a critical reasoning. But if you're great at grammar, Brian's going to talk to you about that.
So Brian, what do you think about this?
There's a Grammar Girl website that's it's pretty popular and pretty good. I want to be the grammar guy. So actually, to some extent, I kind of disagree that they're radically different. Kind of the way I like to look at these, particularly for people who read frequently, for native English speakers especially, who read frequently and just really comfortable with the language, based on usage, if not like names of rules, if you're not constantly thinking about gerunds or anything like that, is they're basically, the way I see them, really local reading comprehension. They're both really about meaning. With GRE, it's, hey, which word really fits the meaning of a sentence? Like, there's a couple words that are kind of related, but if you want to say, what is the sentence exactly trying to say? Which one of these words? You kind of have to split hairs on local meaning. With sentence correction, we were at a meeting years ago, and the guy who wrote the GMAT scoring algorithm, Dr. Rudner, had even mentioned at one point he had gone to the test writers and said, like, hey, why are we testing random grammar? Like, we should get rid of it. It's just like, it's an international test. Why are these grammar rules important? And the authors of the question said, no, look at what we're doing. This is all about meaning and how grammar impacts meaning. And so, his eyes were open. He came over and was talking to me, and David and I have a friend, Chris, who, co-wrote all the GMAT curriculum with us, and Dr. Rudner was just thrilled to tell us, like, no, it's about meaning. So I actually think that the two are a little bit more similar. If you have a really good command of the language and have been, reading a lot, it kind of rewards just, like, what have you seen as you've been reading well-written material? Also advocate a little for sentence correction in that the number of rules that they test it's a pretty narrow scope, and so it's really repeatable. So that the difference, I would say, is there are some individual words you need to know for the GRE, and it's kind of frustrating, I think, to try to memorize 500 to 600 words, knowing that of that list, maybe 6 or 7 will make any kind of a difference. Whereas with the GMAT, it's if you know that they're testing subject-verb agreement and modifier placement and parallelism in a series and those kind of things, and there's maybe 10 things you need to get really good at. I like sentence correction because as you're learning the rules, each one of them is very, very repeatable once you get pretty good at them. So I would say, if you're kind of looking to study a handful of things that you need to practice with and get really good at, but they're repeatable, that's a GMAT sentence correction. If you need to, if you're better at, memorizing large lists of things, you'll enjoy studying for the GRE a little bit more.
And I have to say, an admissions director at a top 10 business school once told me that they found the verbal section and the verbal scores fascinating when it came to kind of predicting student success, even though many people put this emphasis on, business school is kind of a numbers thing. And I know that the bankers and engineers will cringe, but there are several admissions officers who kind of feel like the verbal is sometimes where people really distinguish themselves because there's so many engineers out there who kind of blow the curve on the math, right? So seeing a great verbal score can be important. And personally, I'm kind of a liberal arts grad, and so I liked both of these types of sections on these tests, having taken both exams as well. So it does seem like, to Brian's point, they are testing similar things, but they're doing it in a pretty different way. Sentence correction is one thing and vocab is another. So again, put a check mark if you're listening along here and keeping score. Put a check mark in the one that's most comfortable for you, based on what Brian and David have said here. I want to move on and talk about this 7th category, which is this kind of what we're calling better test. Like the GMAT was designed by business schools for business schools, and it tests the exact type of stuff that business candidates, MBA candidates need to know. So what do you guys think about that? I mean, let's start with Brian, since you're arguing on the GMAT side of things, and the GMAT is the kind of business school exam, or it was created for that purpose. So what do you think, Brian?
Speaking to pre-MBA students, anyone who knows the test pretty well will say the GMAT is a better written test for its purpose. The GRE is, it's broad. It's engineers and liberal arts majors and people getting PhDs in really specialized categories. There's so many different, it's written to try to test basic skills for a broad scope of reasons, whereas the GMAT, like David had mentioned, you're getting a pre-business education about critical thinking and even the non-calculator math, being able to see relationships between numbers and quantities pretty quickly. So the GMAT, I think, is a better written test. Like we mentioned about reading, the answers are really precise. It's just a really well-written test for its purpose. The other interesting one there too is you're competing against other pre-business students. And so because of that, it's everybody taking the GMAT is looking for an MBA or a master's in finance or something really related. The GRE kind of has that issue where, the curves are a little bit off because, some people are taking it for a liberal arts PhD or master's program. And they don't really care about the math. And other people are doing it with engineering and they really care about the math, but they don't care at all about the verbal. So, I think the GMAT's a better test, but I can kind of predict my opponent's argument is does that really matter if your goal is just to get in? So, David, I don't know what you have to say about that.
Yeah, David, let's hear your take on this.
My 2 words: who cares? Right? Who cares? So, we can certainly sit around and debate the merits of the GMAT, which is a really unique challenge. And again, I mentioned the LSAT, which has its own really unique section. They have these logic games, and of course the GMAT has a couple of really great sentence correction and data sufficiency are both just really standout sections of the GMAT. And if you were going to teach only one test, in life, I think, Brian has it with teaching the GMAT. There's more variety. But I'm assuming what people are wanting to do is get into business school. And so who cares, right? If the schools accept the GRE, it doesn't really matter that the GMAT is a little bit better written of a test. You can master the GRE most likely in a shorter amount of time. There's less material to study. And on the math section, you are competing against a bunch of people that are going to get a PhD in poetry. So, that math score is a little bit easier to attain. So, not sure that you need to put a check mark for this one, because for you, does it really matter which one's the better test?
Yeah, fair point. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, I think the key thing that's happened, even, since, it's been several years now that schools have been taking the GRE. And so you do make a very fair point, which is that if they're putting it up on their website that they're taking the test, then you as the candidate can assume nothing other than the fact that they're happy to get a score in one test or the other. So I understand that. And I think Brian's point is fair too, in that, the GMAT is written for business school. You're only taking it with other people who are taking or pursuing, graduate management education. So there are arguments on both sides. We'll let our listeners decide where they want to fall there. The next section, our 8th section, is about user friendliness for these tests. And David, I want to stick with you on this one because I think the GRE, you probably have some elements in your favor here. So I want to hear what you have to say first about the kind of user friendliness of the GRE, and then we'll turn it over to Brian and see what he has to say.
So you can flag questions and return. Each section is only 20 questions long. And, then you get to sort of transition versus the one question at a time, 62 minutes or 66 minutes. There's a calculator, and they've just done everything they can to make sure that the GRE is a much more, student-friendly test. Did I mention that you get an actual pencil? Now, they don't generally sharpen these pencils, but you get an actual pencil and a piece of paper. So user-friendly all the way around.
So, Brian, what do you say about this?
Man, if pencil versus marker is the way you're deciding which test to take, I don't know what that says about you, right? So it's just as
don't knock it, don't knock it.
It's I think GMAT has tried to get more and more user friendly, and what's tricky is it's hard. Their whole game is it's non-calculator math. Like they really can't change from that. The adaptive scoring that it kind of dictates that you can't move around within a section. So they're sort of boxed in there. They have tried to make the test shorter. So they cut off 30 minutes from the test about a year or so ago. So it's shorter than it used to be, which, we kind of joked when they made that decision. We were joking at Veritas headquarters that the tagline, take the GMAT, you'll be home for happy hour, is kind of like, is that really what matters on that day? But, kind of it helps a little bit with brain drain that, it's a shorter test. You can, you're not taking as long of a test. Your the mental stamina and all that isn't as tough. I don't know that I can campaign for it being more user friendly, other than the fact that the rules are the same for everyone. And so, again, if a slightly harder test, if you're good at something, you want a harder course. If you're American Gladiators or something like that, you want the hardest possible obstacle course because you want to be able to show that that you've separated yourself from everyone. So I'll concede GRE is a little bit more user friendly. The GMAT has I think more user-friendly score cancellation policies and those kind of things. But, hopefully that's, you never need to use them. So, it's a better insurance policy. Who really cares? You just don't want to use it. So, it's easier. You're more user-friendly, the GRE, but it's easier for your competition too.
Okay. So, I do think it's probably fair to say that the GRE, I think David said it's sort of a kinder, gentler test experience. And that because you can move around, things like that. But I hear you. I think there are some benefits to kind of everyone having the same, kind of running through, not jumping around, that kind of thing. So there are arguments on both sides, but I do think that the GRE, it seems like in-test experience is a bit more user-friendly. Obviously, yeah, there are some better cancellation policies and things on the GMAT side, so kind of post-test what you're going to do. So our final and ninth category here is one of the myths that I actually discussed at the outset, or one of the kind of concepts I put out there, which is about school preference, basically. And the argument is that the GMAT is the test schools have been using for decades, and it's a business-specific test. And if there's a preference, it's the GMAT. Admissions officers, they're used to interpreting that data, right? So, what do you guys have to say about that? Let's start with Brian.
You're right that that's kind of been the traditional argument. And I have heard admissions officers say, we prefer the GMAT. They'll say that, we prefer, although it's tricky to know what does that really mean. So I think, it's a preference. I think in a perfect world, if a school could have every one of their admits have a 730 GMAT or higher, they would love that. But we don't live in that world. Some people don't have as much time to prepare for the test, or get a little test anxiety, or have different career paths that have led them there, and they want to admit people who don't have the strongest math backgrounds and may struggle on the GMAT curve. So you'll hear preference. It's hard to read in what that means because they accept the GRE, and so you kind of have to take them at their word. So I think what it comes down to is David had mentioned it earlier. If you can perform really well, a high GMAT score that boosts their average, and schools always want to look like they're the most selective, the most competitive, and all those kind of things. If you can post a high GMAT score, that's the most satisfying test experience that you could give to an admissions officer. We accepted this great candidate. She had a 770. That checks all the boxes. But if you're unable to give that score, if it's above the school's average or right there, I think that may be nowadays where the preference kind of ends.
Mm-hmm. So, David, what do you think about this in terms of schools preferring the GMAT exam?
Yeah, Brian's exactly right. There's nothing you can do on the GRE to equate a 750 or higher GMAT score. If you can go 750 or higher on the GMAT, there's nothing you can do on the GRE that would do the same thing for the schools. But let's talk about the GRE in terms of that person who's maybe not going to get that high of a score, get that little bit lower score, but the school really wants to admit them. They don't have to report that lower GMAT. So the school is going to prefer, with a really great candidate, that they go ahead and have that GRE score so they don't have to report that. And then the other thing, of course, is that the GRE is accepted for all sorts of other programs. As I mentioned, even the law schools are now accepting, many law schools, the GRE as opposed to the LSAT. So I think that, if you're going to be able to score really well, it's the GMAT. If you're applying to multiple programs, or you've got a great background and kind of a low score, schools are probably going to prefer that GRE.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I wanted to just give you guys a chance to each make kind of a closing remark. Obviously, we've given everyone these 9 categories. Folks should be keeping score and have a sense of where they fall on these 2 tests. But Brian, I'll let you go first. Is there anything else that you kind of want to add? And just keep in mind that folks listening are trying to decide, between the 2 tests. So any kind of closing remarks you want to make?
Yeah, definitely. So kind of, my closing statement, kind of advocating for the GMAT here. I would say if you're, and not even advocating for the GMAT, take the test that's best for you. I would say the GMAT is it's more forgiving with the scoring algorithm, that you can make mistakes and recover in a way that's harder on the GRE. So someone who knows that they have relatively high ability, but is prone to just kind of quick, silly mistakes at times, you may want to lead toward the GMAT, because they'll have more opportunities to demonstrate that high ability without being more punished for a couple of silly mistakes. If you can get a GMAT score that's above the average of the school you're applying to, that's a preference. It's one of the easiest ways. We live in a quantitative society. The very fact that there are rankings means that we want to know, is this the 6th best ranked school or the 20th best ranked school? And GMAT score is the kind of a standard standard measure that, is the easiest one to interpret for competitiveness of a school. And so if you have the chance to help your school out by pulling up their average, they're going to love that. Like David said, in a way you can't really replicate on the GRE. And, it is a score that admissions officers know how to deal with. And so, like we said, the argument will start to, lose its weight, year after year after year. But I think we're still at a point now where, the GRE is a great option if you're a stellar candidate who's going to have a lower GMAT. Like that's typically been the profile of who gets in. It's an amazing applicant. They just don't want to have to report your score or know what to do with it. And so, on the other hand, if you kind of think like, hey, I'm just sort of a regular applicant, I need a way to separate myself, putting in the time, effort to post a high GMAT score is a way to separate yourself if you kind of look at your resume and everything else and say, I'm going to be like everybody else. So it's one more chance to separate yourself that the GRE doesn't really give you. So if you fall into any of those categories, the GMAT is probably a better choice for you.
So David, before I turn over to you, I just want to mention that I think schools are increasingly, they are starting to share average GRE scores. So I think even that argument, as you said, Brian, may fade with time. But David, what's your kind of closing remarks on choosing a test?
So I'd like everybody to close their eyes and think back to 10 years ago. The GRE was not accepted for business schools. The GMAT was longer. You could not choose the order in which to take the sections. You couldn't cancel your score without before seeing it. You had to cancel the score without ever seeing your score. If you saw the score, you couldn't cancel it. The GMAT was incredibly not user-friendly 10 years ago. So even if you end up deciding you want to take the GMAT, you have to thank the GRE. Because the people at GMAC are actually making the GMAT more user-friendly in response to the competition of the GRE. So it's great to have the option of taking either test. The kind of people that want to take the GRE are maybe people that are a little bit stronger in the verbal. Maybe their math is a little bit more straightforward. They want that calculator. Maybe they have a little bit of test anxiety and they want to be able to move around within the section. Just count the check marks and see which way you're leaning, and I bet a lot of you are going to be leaning in the direction of the GRE. It might not be the sort of challenge that the GMAT is, but you're trying to get into business school, and the GRE is a great way to do it.
So, yeah, well said. David and Brian, I just wanted to thank you both so much for taking part. And listeners, tally up your check marks, see where you fall in terms of which test you should be taking. And, I just want to encourage everyone to continue to subscribe to and rate and ideally review this podcast over on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. We're now on Spotify, as I've mentioned, and Stitcher and Google Play. So please keep tuning in, and we have a lot of really interesting episodes on tap. But once again, Brian and David, I really appreciate you guys making time to discuss this kind of GRE versus GMAT stuff. And I think we've given people a lot of really good insights and kind of a checklist they can use to make this decision. So thank you both so much.
Hey, thank you for having us, and best of luck to everyone. I think the last thing I'll say is if you decide to change at some point, studying for one is going to make you better at the other. So best of luck to everyone, and thanks again for the opportunity here.
Thanks, everyone. We'll be back soon with more episodes.
Thanks, guys.